You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. Listen to Latin Ways. I'm your host, Sylvia Richardson. I'm delighted to be joined by my guest, Maria Paez. Dr. Paez is a sociologist of Canadian and Venezuelan ancestry. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure.
I thought it was wonderful when you wrote an article, recently about, remembering this colonial past that continues to be in our present. It continues to take form in our present. So perhaps you can paint a picture for our audience. What has this colonial wounding that we all have been born into manifested into in the 21st century?
A problem is with the word colonialism, because it's very historic. So if you say, this is due to colonialism, people think you're talking about something, in the 15th century, which of course it was. But the trouble is exactly what you have just said. It really is, another word for it really, is imperialism, which is now in the 16th, 17th century. The imperialism was called colonialism because they physically took over the political structure of countries, and pillaged Latin America and Africa, but basically, most importantly. And the money that was taken out of the silver and gold mines of Latin America were what fueled the Industrial Revolution in Europe. This is not me saying this, okay? These are scholars that have studied all of this, where the money came from and all of this. So Spain ravaged, and Brazil and Portugal ravaged Latin America and extracted all of this slave labor from making the indigenous people slaves and then bringing in the black people from Spain. And historians usually call this mercantilism. So then Spain got all this money. And of course they squandered it. The upper class of Spain squandered all this money on building their houses and their lavish, life. And so they had to get things, and they got them from Europe. And so all that metals went to Europe, went to the Netherlands, and went to France, and went to Britain and all of that. So Latin America, and of course Africa through their slaves, and all the sugar in Caribbean and all that, they were the basis of the Industrial Revolution, of the so-called progress of Europe. Now we live in a different era. So in a different era, the United States and France and Germany can't walk into one of our countries and say, we're taking over, like they did in the past. Now, how do they take over? They take over through economics, because the world is united in one very special thing, which is the use of the American dollar. The gold standard was left aside a long time ago, and it was decided that it would be used, the dollar would be used, and the dollar pegged to petroleum. And so this is the situation, for example, that Venezuela is in. The Chinese, I would say, intellectual who wrote The Art of War, I can never pronounce his name, he said every war starts off being an economic war. And this is what is happening in Venezuela, that it's an economic war. So we come to your basic question, and that is, yes, I talk about colonialism because it is a description of something that happened in the past, but it is not something that stopped. It is something that continues today with other arms, with other weapons. And it's, to my mind, it is best said that it is through imperialism, not capitalism, but imperialism, because there are capitalist countries that sort of live by themselves and aren't trying to overthrow other countries and whatnot. But imperialism is capitalism that is sitting on top of a tank and steamrolling over other countries. And of course, that is what the United States is doing with its allies, Canada, especially Canada. In the last couple of decades has been the junior partner of that, and of course the Europeans, who have some degrees of freedom, but not too much.
It's interesting that you bring the idea of empire. Most of us learning history classes about the Ottoman Empire, about the Roman Empire, about the British Empire, but we never talk about the U.S. Empire. We never talk about the Canadian Empire practices. When we think about the role of empire, really is hegemony, right? This idea that the rest of the world now takes the form, the customs, the practices of the empire. Colonization is occupying someone's territory, but empire really is about hegemony. It's about the overt assertion of power and coercive power at that, because most people in Latin America, like people in El Salvador who have one major river that's the source of water for the entire country, did not ask for mining companies to take over half the land and pollute and poison the water. And I'm sure that most people in other parts of the world did not choose that form of so-called, advancement of development. So let's talk a little bit about then, how is it that this idea, that forms and informs who we are as a society, we're all reaping the benefits of the displacement of indigenous people, or the theft and the murders of indigenous children, right? Because those lands were taken not by friendly gestures, but by acts of war. What is our responsibility, in this moment, where in Latin America we say recordar. Recordar means both to remember and to awaken. It's one of those double meaning words. And I think it's very apt to describe this moment, that it's not just about seeing something as something that happened in the past, but recognizing that if we're holding the bag, it's our responsibility to do something about it, to transform it.
Well, the discovery of those thousands of bodies of children in these former residential schools, if that isn't a wake-up call for Canada and for Canadians, I don't know what is. This is perhaps the most outrageous thing that has ever happened in Canadian history. This is heinous. This is one of the worst possible things, is the death of children. And 150,000 Indigenous children went through these schools. And hundreds of them disappeared, and the Indigenous people were saying, we don't know what happened to them, they're gone. There's not, nothing happened until now. That they use this machine that's sort of like an X-ray machine that can see what's underneath the land. And this was organized by the indigenous communities. The government didn't want to go looking for these bodies. The indigenous people kept on saying, look, they disappeared. What happened to these bodies? And because they were able to pay these people to do these X-rays, now they found them. Now what is to be done? This is the big question. How is Canada going to, well, it can't erase this past, but how is it going to go forward with this? In the article that I wrote, one of the things that I underlined is that the Canadian government, confederation, before and after, was constructed without the indigenous peoples. Heaven's sake, they hung Louis Riel as a traitor, the only indigenous person who was involved with the confederation. One of the things that I say at the end of my article is that indigenous peoples must be given a place on the table. that they have a legitimate position to take in the affairs of the nation. It is not possible that we have a cabinet, that we have, an executive, that we have a legislature, and the indigenous peoples are peripheral to them. They are not seen as decision makers in Canada. This is awful. I get really upset when people say, "Oh, this land belonged to the Mohawks, and we honor them." This, the other. I quite frankly, I say, well, this is good because it makes people, aware of this, and I think that is very positive, and people should say that. This land where we are right now used to belong to this or that, the Hurons or whatever. But we have to go one step beyond that, because how can it be that Canada, one of the most prosperous, richest countries in the world, member of the OECD, has hundreds and hundreds of indigenous people that don't have clean water to drink? Just think of it. Clean water. We're not talking about the slums of India, okay? This is, to me, what the death of these children can be a catalyst that something be done now, not tomorrow, but now, so that the indigenous peoples, their health statistics can come up to the standard of the rest of Canadians. How come they have greater incidence of death, greater incidence of suicide, greater incidence of child suicide? How come they have the greatest incidence of controllable or curable diseases like diabetes, like heart failure? How come these incidences are worse for the indigenous people today? That's where we have to go. They did the apologies. This is terrible. These people are all dead who ran these schools, most of them, I presume. But we have what Venezuelans would say, a social and political debt with the indigenous peoples who are living now.
One of the things that I think is wonderful that you bring up is that this legacy of colonization continues today. It hasn't gone away. It has taken many different forms. Perhaps now we call it economic embargoes. Perhaps now we call it, economic sanctions. Perhaps now we call it indigenous reserves, right? Where indigenous people are allowed to live, but but the government sort of rules the land, and then they give permission to mining companies to go and plunder the land and poison the water that they're supposed to be drinking. So in many ways, after 100 years of imposed juridical violence, because that's what this is, hegemony in Canada took place through laws, right? Just because it's legal doesn't mean it was just or even, the right thing to do. There is laws that rule the movement of indigenous people, and the last residential school only closed in 1996, so it's not something that happened 100 years ago. It happened over 100 years. They did it for 100 years, but it only closed in 1996. So we still have the children who went to those schools who are still suffering from the trauma. And I think perhaps it's also important to recognize the intergenerational trauma that carries on, right? When you were denied access to the very basics you need as a child, the right to feel secure attachment to your parents, to have someone love you and hold you and, tend to you. All of those things.
All of this came out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And you read it, it's horrific, but all of this came out. But what is new now, because the commission, its conclusion was there was cultural genocide here. But what the discovery of these cemeteries shows is that there was an actual genocide.
Absolutely.
That there was not just the psychological and the abuse and this kind of, cultural genocide, which is because they wanted to eradicate their culture. We've got dead bodies here. We've got dead children. In a massive amount. It isn't, a few. Because remember, they've only done this in, I think, 3 3 schools. There were dozens of these schools, which they haven't examined yet. So we're looking at real genocide here, and Canada has to wake up and realize this is true. And furthermore, it has to realize what is the situation of the Indigenous peoples today. And it's a slow murder, if you ask me, if you can't get clean water in 2021 in Canada.
It should be no surprise to people who are learning of this, of the government's capacity to ignore the needs of its own people, to ignore the needs of Indigenous people, and to witness, the mass numbers of them suffering the ramifications of, violence, and to simply stand by idly. We still, we need another study, we need another commission to investigate, another report. We already know what we need to do. What we need to do is eradicate the abject poverty that Indigenous people are forced to live with. We need to create services so that we can help people heal the trauma that they've been through. We need to create community education programs so we can end the racism that Indigenous people are forced to live with from Caucasians as well as from other immigrants, because we all bring our own wounds of racism and we all spread our messiness, unless we unlearn colonization, unless we decolonize the way we see ourselves, we won't be able to understand why other people in other countries like Venezuela don't want to be under the foot of the U.S. and have somebody else decide for them what they need to do and how they should organize their affairs.
Now, one of the important things about the Indigenous peoples of Canada is very unique to Canada. A lot of them have a document signed by the Crown, that is the British Crown, and they adhere very much to this. This is an important piece of paper for them. If anyone ever tried to get rid of the monarchy in Canada, the first people who will oppose that is going to be the Indigenous peoples. And you're going to say, well, how can this be? Because these signed agreements with the British Crown has been, in many instances, the defense of Indigenous peoples against the Canadian government. This is really complicated, and I don't really know the ins and outs of it all. But I can tell you that the Indigenous peoples feel great importance to those documents because they were the first that actually gave them certain rights vis-a-vis whatever colonial power was here in Canada. Now, what does this mean? This means that what subsequent Canadian governments wanted to do was to deny the nationhood of the Indigenous peoples. They kind of said, oh, no, we have to be the nation of Canada, and we're not going to let, another nation inside of us. But if you talk to Indigenous peoples, they'll talk about the Mohawk Nation, They'll talk about the Haida Gwaii Nation, So what did the government did, and I can't remember what year this happened, they said, oh, no, Indigenous peoples have to be democratic. You know what that was? That was a way of getting rid of their traditional ways of government. Mm-hmm. Because the traditional way, I'm not saying it might, because there's no government that's perfect. I'm not saying it was perfect, but their ways of governing themselves was according to long-standing traditions of chiefs and people getting together. So, for example, amongst the Mohawk, it's the women who are the leaders, So each group had its way of governing itself. So along came the government with the wonderful idea that, no, they got to be democratic. You've got to elect them. And so this is why we have a situation amongst some of them that you have two types of leadership. You have the leadership that the Canadian governments accept because, people have to vote, and these are the people who are given the money. These are the people who are told, okay, this council, we recognize you. We're going to give you the money and you this, in order to undermine the one that is the traditional leaders. So that was a big break of the back of the Indigenous peoples, in which the Canadian government said, you now have to govern yourselves according to what we say, and if you don't, you're not going to get money from the government. And this is what's happening right now. That's why they are all divided. That's why they can't sort of come together very well. So it has been a question of divide and rule.
I think in many ways, just like most of us in Latin America, indigenous and non-indigenous, are not homogeneous. Indigenous people in Canada are also not homogeneous.
No, of course
and so the Indian Act, which has been in place, really came in to divide and conquer. Did you know that until recently, I think it was 1960, 1970, they couldn't even defend themselves in court unless they rejected their indigenous status. So they gave all their rights away, and then they could go to the government and say, I've been harmed by the government. That doesn't make sense, right? You first have to deny your own heritage, who you are as a person, and accept this new colonial government, the Canada as your, and then you can have rights. So in the same way, I think many of us in Latin America can sympathize and empathize, because that has been done to us over and over again. The minute people choose to elect a government that will choose the rights of the local people, the U.S. will put sanctions, blockade, block your ability to trade and sell your goods with others, so you can, advance the interests of your people. And, or, you'll have aggression, in the form of war, right? That's been done.
Don't leave out Canada. Remember, Canada overthrew the government of Honduras. Mm-hmm. Canada overthrew the government of Haiti. Mm-hmm. Canada has its hands bloodied with what they're doing to Venezuela. It's also done terrible things to El Salvador. So Canada has been in there very quietly doing the dirty work of the Americans. And, most Canadians don't know this. Most Canadians have no idea that Canada is doing this kind of stuff. Because I've said it many times, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Canada is a sinister, secretive government ministry that never tells Canadians what exactly it is doing, that lies. Its website is an atrocity of lies. And furthermore, we have, I am sure she is a CIA agent, which is Mrs. Freeland. If she isn't, she was just, completely brainwashed in the United States, because it has been under her that Canada has advanced by leaps and bounds in attacking the popular governments of Latin America. She is a sinister person. And Trudeau, well, I'm sorry for Mr. Trudeau, who seems a very nice person, but he is a very ineffective and weak person, who is obviously, tossed about and told what to do by these other stronger people. I know his father would be turning in his grave to see what has happened to Canada. But I think that this awakening that we're watching, because I have not spoken with anyone in this country that hasn't been appalled by what happened with those children. Not one person has said to me, oh, well, this happened in the past. No, I think the whole country is appalled. And maybe something good will come out of this if they understand that Canada is not Europe. The strong characteristic of this country is that it has indigenous people, and people come here from Europe and from other places of the world and whatnot that don't have indigenous peoples, and they don't get it. I belong to the Louis Riel Bolivarian Circle, which we founded in 2003. And since then, we've been here in Toronto really fighting for Venezuela. And about 5 years ago, or maybe 6, we did an event at the University of Toronto. And we invited the president, I think his name is Charnier, I think his name was, to come and speak to to us about Louis Riel, because our name is Louis Riel, and we wanted the president of the Métis Nation to come, and he came. He was a delightful person. He was a lawyer, and he told us to a packed audience. This was a large classroom at U of T, packed with people, sitting on the floor, all the struggles of the Métis Nation and what Louis Riel, meant to them, and his struggles and his battles. And when that finished, the president of the Métis Nation said to me, "This is the first time that a group of people, mostly immigrants, have spoken to us and invited us to come and speak to." I felt honored, very nice, and then appalled that we are living with our back. This whole country is living with our back to the Indigenous people. They should be front and center of this country, because Canada is not Europe. And I can't say that enough. We were having a conference about 4 years ago. We were organizing this conference on the environment in Montreal, and I was in the steering committee, and I said, okay, we have to start off by bringing someone here from the Indigenous peoples to open the conference and say a prayer at the beginning. Well, one of these guys was saying, "No, not a prayer. I say a prayer. This is a serious thing about environment." And I said, this is Canada. I had to tell him. And yes, we must start with the prayer from the Indigenous peoples. I mean, it was like this guy was so Europeanized that he didn't get it. And we have to do this work of teaching Canadians that we're not living in Europe.
Thank you again for being with us. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com. Please visit the website to hear previous shows, hear about upcoming events, and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month.